Why are they in that situation? How do they go about addressing that conflict? And where and when does it happen? What is the context for the situation? So by answering these questions, just by giving yourself the simple assignment, can I answer all these questions? You can very quickly assess whether or not your story is going to make sense, and whether or not your story is coherent. So these elements, right, are what comprise a story. These are the things that make up a story. But that's only one way of thinking about a story, right? A story also has to have movement. It has to have dynamics. It has to have change, right? And so there are elements to the story that you can think about in terms of going back to this beginning, middle, and end idea, right? What is a beginning, a middle, and an end? And that it's, these things are so basic to us, they're so built into us, that it's hard sometimes to articulate them. It's hard sometimes to explain what these things are, right? What is a beginning, a middle, and an end? What is a beginning?
An introduction.
What does that mean?
Like, you get introduced to the characters and, like, who they are.
So,
I mean, even if you're telling a story, like, what it's about.
Right? It's presenting a situation, right? It's answering those what, who, what, why, and where questions, but it's presenting a starting point for a situation, right? So a beginning only is a beginning in relationship to the middle and the end, right? Any point in the story could be the beginning. You can choose where you want your story to begin. It's by defining what's going to happen between the beginning and the end that defines what it is the beginning, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? You could start a story at any point, as long as from that point until where you define as the end, something occurs, some change occurs, right? And so that middle is that part where the change is occurring, right? So you have your starting point, your introduction to the elements of your story, the who, what, why, when, where, and how, or maybe not the how. The how is probably more in that middle section, right? You set up the starting circumstances, and then a conflict occurs that causes a change. Something causes change to this starting point. It could be self-motivated, it could be an exterior force coming in, it could be a conflict between two characters. Something causes a change, and then there's a resolution that results in a shift, a change from the beginning to the end. A story is not a story if it doesn't end in a different place than it began. Okay, even a story that ends back where it started, something is different, or else there's no story, or else there's nothing engaging. So why is storytelling important? It's a broader question, but a really important one. Why bother telling stories? Anybody?
It's how we communicate to each other as people.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's how we communicate to each other. We communicate just in general. We're constantly telling stories to one another. When you relay to your parents about what happened at the workshop today, when you are relaying the story of a date you went on the other night, when you're doing anything, when you're communicating with one another, when we communicate to each other in the world, we do it through storytelling. So storytelling is important. It's how we communicate in the world. But there's also a bigger sense when you're talking about fictional stories.
It gives you a chance to escape.
It gives you a chance to, well, telling the story doesn't necessarily give you a chance to escape. But listening to a story gives you a chance to escape. And escape, what does that mean, escape?
To, get out of your life and get into somebody else's.
And why did we need to do that?
Because some people aren't happy with their lives.
Yeah, I guess, although I think there's a simpler answer than that, but yeah.
It's kind of different, but a lot of the time a story will give a message or a moral that it intends for the audience to kind of take in and keep.
That's a very important aspect. I'll get back to what you're saying, but the idea, typically what we call theme, right?
Yeah.
A theme is a point of view, an idea, a thesis that you would like to communicate, that you as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, want to share with people because you think it's important. You think it's important. You think it's useful to know that, like an example I watched recently and I thought it was a really nice example. There's a film called Three Kings. Have you seen Three Kings? None of you have seen Three Kings? Wow, it's so sad. You've seen it. One person's seen it. It's a war about a movie about the first Iraq War in the early 90s. It's David O. Russell. And it's George Clooney and, I don't know, Mark Wahlberg and I don't remember who the third guy is. Spike Jones,
Yeah.
right? Spike Jones,
He's
that's
in it,
right.
yeah.
That's right, yeah. Anyway, great film, really amazing film about a couple soldiers. The war is over, and they've got to basically they're trying to steal gold from Saddam Hussein or something. But anyway, there's a moment early in the story where somebody talks about courage, and they say, somebody says something about being afraid, and the person responds, courage is not being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and doing it anyway. And that becomes the theme of the movie in general, is that, to be courageous, to take that risk, is not about being fearless. No one's fearless. Everyone has fear. What's really courageous is to be afraid and take the risk anyway. And that theme is an interesting idea, and it's helpful, right? If you can communicate that to somebody, you can teach somebody that lesson, it might help them live a better life. It might help them make those difficult decisions, right? And so the filmmaker, the writer of that, decided this is something worth talking about. I want to communicate this to people, and I'm going to tell it in a story. Because if I just tell you that, you're like, yeah, okay, that sounds interesting, but it doesn't mean anything, and it's not going to make you change. But story has a magical component. And this goes back to this getting out of our lives. When a story works, it's almost like a dream, right? You step into a dream, you are able to live in this other world where anything can happen. And where a crafty storyteller, a good filmmaker, for example, can take you on a journey and let you actually experience the situation. You actually go through the emotions that the characters go through. You actually learn just the same way you would learn if you had had that experience yourself. So by storytelling, by using, especially with film, you were able to teach lessons in that inherent way by taking somebody out of their real life into this fictional life, and then having them go through experiences and learn lessons, learn things. They don't actually have to touch the pot and burn their hand, because they saw it in a movie, and during the movie they really felt it. They really understood, if you do that, that's going to really hurt. And that is the power of film, and that is the power of storytelling. That's why we do this stuff, right? It's not just, because it's cool, or because it's fun, or because it's, interesting. It's because there's an actual value to society in this stuff. And so theme, this idea, the fundamental reason why, the purpose for your story, is absolutely critical to everything that goes into the story. And if you know what your theme is, it helps answer all those questions about what should happen in the story, what needs to happen next, how does this go, what's going to happen first and then second and then next and so forth. If you know the answer to your theme, what is this story really about, answering those little questions become easy, because they're built in. In order to serve the theme, these other things happen. I like to say that story is like the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine of theme go down, right? If you just tell somebody a theme, love conquers all, love overcomes financial difficulties, right? Like Romeo and Juliet, then nobody cares if you just say that theme out loud. But if you tell a story that conveys it, they inherently understand the theme without having to hear it spelled out so pedantically. So this is, again, part of the reason for this. But in order to do this, you have to trick your audience. You have to engage your audience and hold their attention for the duration of the story. Because we're very sophisticated at watching movies. We're very sophisticated at understanding stories and listening to them and taking them apart. And so you have to sort of overcome that natural ability of your audience to want to, step outside and take advantage, or not take advantage, but take apart your story and not absorb themselves in it. And so in order to do that, we need to keep pulling them along. And the way we keep pulling them along, there's a few different things about this, but one idea is that the story needs to constantly be moving like this, not like this, right? So if instead of something happening and then something else happens and then something else happens and then something else happens, right? That would be a series of events. But if instead something happens and then because of that something else happens, and then because of that something else happens, and because of that something else happens, now you're building a story. Right? So this is just a series of events. This happens and then that happens. This happens and then that happens. In this case, this happens because that happens. This happens because that happens. And now you've got something that's growing. It's pulling the story, pulling the audience along. every scene must compel the scene that comes after it, right? Every scene must demand the scene that comes after it, and every scene can only exist because of what happened before it. If you've got a scene that could have existed at this point in the story, or at this point in the story, or any point in the story, it doesn't belong. Every story, every scene must compel what comes after it, and every scene must depend on what came before it. That simple rule is a really good way to test your stories to see if they're making sense. Secondly, we have this idea of obstacles. Okay, so whenever you're dealing with these, you beginning, middle, and end, your character in conflict and context, you need to think about how are they going to get from the beginning to the end? How are they going to move from the starting point of the story to where they're eventually going to grow to? And we do that through overcoming obstacles. Okay, typically, your typical story has 3 basic points to it. 3 basic obstacles. Right, so you've got what we call a story arc, or a character arc, is the idea of a journey between starting here and going on this journey to reach some destination, some change, some mental realization, or some transformation that goes on within your character. The more points along your story, so if I only have one story point, really, they start here, one thing happens, and then they change. Something happens at the end. We have a very straight line story, right? And it becomes very, it's not very dynamic, it's not very engaging, and it's too easy to see what happened, and that we don't believe it. But the more points along your story, something with a bunch of points in it, you create something that becomes organic and smooth, so we don't notice the transformation happening from one thing to the next. And by not noticing, you overcome that inherent cynicism that your audience has. You're able to trick them into following your story along. So the more points you have, the smoother the story is. At the minimum number of points you need are basically 3. You start here, 3 obstacles. So 3 points along the way, and then a conclusion. Right? So you've got your simple arc like that, where your character starts someplace, and then they face an obstacle. Okay, they face a first challenge to who they are. So if we don't know who they are, we don't know what this obstacle is going to be. But if we do know who they are, if you've defined who your character is, what their characteristics are, what makes them unique, then it's obvious what the obstacles are going to be. They're going to be things that challenge that specific thing about them. If you've got somebody who's OCD, it's going to be something that challenges that obsession with organization. If you've got somebody who's a slob, then it's going to be something that challenges that their world doesn't work because they're too messy. Those are 2 extremes on the same continuum. So the first obstacle comes, and the person must overcome or must fight that obstacle. This could be another character, it could be something within themselves, or it could be nature. Right? We typically talk about conflict as falling into one of those 3 categories. Right? Man against man. Man versus nature. And man versus himself. And
there also man versus society?
I would consider that man versus man, although it's an interesting variance on that, sure. What was that?
And there's also man versus God.
God?
That counts as nature.
I would consider that versus nature. I mean, terminology, but fair enough. You could, make that its own.
It is arguable.
Yeah, sure. But in both of those cases, society and man, God, nature, it's sort of an expanding on the same thing. 2 people with different opinions or different goals being put in conflict with one another. A person being put against something that is essentially unchangeable, right? Nature / God is something that is what it is, and it's always going to be what it is. And if it's a man versus nature, ultimately, it's going to be trying to overcome something that is not surmountable. You have to find a way to adapt with it. You have to find a way to integrate with it. And man versus himself is often about overcoming your own obstacles, your own internal challenges, the walls that we put up, the difficulties we give ourselves, and that happen in everybody. So these are your 3 basic types of conflict, and each of these conflicts that you build into your story needs to be some version of this. And you need to know. Is my conflict one person versus another? Is my conflict the person versus the world? Or is my conflict the person versus himself? And so for each of these conflicts, you need to be able to answer that question, and they have to be specifically related to where we started. They need to be based on who the character was when we began. So you encounter this first conflict, and the person typically is going to succeed. They're going to overcome this conflict. And again, there's variants in stories. Somebody might fail their first conflict, but what happens during that first conflict is they learn something. Something changes. In order to overcome this obstacle, they need to learn or grow or change. In order to prove that they learned and grew and changed, they are challenged again. And this time, they need to put into use what they learned here. If this challenge came before this one, then they wouldn't have been prepared. They wouldn't have been able to overcome this challenge. It's only because of what they encountered in the first challenge that they're able to now overcome the second challenge. And a lot of times, and again, in the feature film, you've got a lot more sophisticated elements, you've got a longer arc. A lot of times the second point will be a failure. So in a sense, the arc will go like this, where you've got, they have a small victory and then a giant failure, and then they have to climb back from that giant failure, and then they finally, in the third obstacle, they have to, again, put into use what they learned here and here, / here, into there. So that third obstacle must be a bigger obstacle than the second obstacle, and the second obstacle must be a bigger obstacle than the first obstacle. Okay? And then, once they've accomplished the third obstacle, now they are prepared to finish, to come back to the starting situation, but with a new understanding. Right? So the ending is almost always some version of the beginning, but with a new perspective. Right? So you started off in one place, and then you often will come back to that place, either physically come back to that place or mentally come back to that place, but with a new understanding and a new, the character comes back with new information, and therefore they are changed. So that simple structure that I'm describing is the basis of virtually every story you can tell. Of course, there's 1,000 variants on it. Of course, you can, when you say the character, it could be a group, it could be an inanimate object, it could be all sorts of things. And the difference of these challenges can be, there are a million different challenges you can provide. But this simple structure works. And it works because it keeps the audience engaged. It works because it buries that theme. It allows you to communicate that theme subtly through the engaging of a story. It works to take the person out of their own life into following your own story. And it works to answer the who, what, why, when, where, and how in a way that is satisfying, and that by the end, your audience feels like they went on the journey and they learned something out of it. So you guys, even with these simple 5-minute films, should be thinking about all of these elements. Should be thinking about how can I incorporate all of these attributes, all of these, incorporating starting with the idea of the character and conflict and context, answering the who, what, why, when, where, and how, thinking about what are my 3 obstacles and how do those obstacles build on one another, how every scene in the movie must compel what comes after it and must be dependent on what came before it. Right? All of these elements are what are going to make your stories work, are going to make your films strong films. And these are the tools that, whether you're writing a 5-minute movie or an hour-long movie, these are the things that you've got to work with. So, and this is a lot of information in a very small amount of time. I realize it's, you may only get certain pieces of it, and you may not be able to do all this in your scripts, but you should strive for it, absolutely, in these projects, and of course as you go on with other projects you work on when you go home. So any questions at this point? Is anybody, anything that's not clear, any ideas that this strikes in your heads, things that you want to, that makes you question or wonder about? Anybody? Yeah.
What about shredded stories that don't end up in complete success? What happens with the obstacles?
Well, the obstacles are the same, because in a story where someone isn't a success, it doesn't mean that they still didn't face increasing obstacles. They still need to be facing increasing obstacles. And when you say success, typically what you've got is some sort of outward success, and then you've also got an inner journey. Most films, most stories that work with, that start with, or that feature a character that is failing, the failure is an exterior failure, while simultaneously there is an interior success going on, or not necessarily a success, but a change. They're still learning something. They're still growing. You may learn that what your original dream was not really worth pursuing. or you may learn that you are not capable of that dream, and you now have to make do with the life that you're handed, right? You may realize that what you thought success was is no longer success. You have to redefine what success is. So, but ultimately, there is still a change. There still must be 3 obstacles that they face, and over the course of those obstacles, in your case, for example, instead of that second obstacle being a failure, it would probably be the other way around. The second obstacle would be a false peak, right? It would be what looks like a great success, and then we're actually going to head back down after that, right? And ultimately towards some transformation where at the end there is still some change. If you've got a story where the character does not change, it is not going to be an engaging story. And what's going to happen is, basically what's going to happen is if you put that onto YouTube or you put it onto television, somebody's just going to change the channel. Nobody's going to watch it. You are asking a favor of your audience to sit through your film. There's a billion other things they could be watching or doing reading books or playing a game, or there's so many other things somebody can do with their time rather than watch your movie. You are asking them the favor of watching your movie because you think it's worth their time. Why is it worth their time? Probably because of a theme. Probably because there's some message you've got that you want to communicate. Some life lesson you learn. Something that you think will be interesting to that person that will change them and make them, will help them. Even the most simplistic entertainment-based, Hollywood schlock still has theme underneath it. Still has ideas underneath it of what's trying to be communicated. So you're always dealing with these elements, no matter what kind of story you're telling. All right. So there are just another little piece about the character, just another terminology that sometimes can be helpful. There's the idea of characters having what we call, character faults, or what I like to call misbehaviors. Right? At the beginning of every story, the character should have certain misbehaviors, certain things that need to be fixed, things they need to learn or grow. And if you define those misbehaviors, the things that they're doing wrong, it gives you a very clear place for your character to go. Right? So if you start off with somebody having certain flaws, by the end of the story, they don't always fix their flaws, but they at least can address those flaws, and they can start working towards fixing them, or we have some sense that they will work towards that in the future, right? So, the idea of developing what your character's flaws are at the beginning is really important. And again, this is something I said while we were listening to your pitches, the obstacles they face must be specific to their flaws. If your character has a flaw like this over here, and then you give them an obstacle that's over here, your audience, it's not like they understand what's wrong. They just don't get it, and they don't get engaged. They're not pulled along. You're not keeping them along by presenting a problem and then addressing that problem and taking it here and then taking it to here and then taking it to here. And meanwhile, your audience is being pulled along with you while they follow your story. If you present a flaw over here, the person is narcissistic, and then, but the challenge you're going to be given is a drinking contest. It's like, well, I thought I was paying attention to the fact that they're narcissistic. Now it's all about this. Now, of course, the drinking contest can be related to the narcissism. It can work for sure. But on its face, they're completely separate issues. So you need to sort of think about making your obstacles specific to the flaws that those characters have.
I was wondering if obstacles always have to be active to the character, or if they can be passive with other characters, but still internally change. Do you know what I mean?
It's a good question, and I think that while it can, if you're creating an obstacle that is essentially a reaction to somebody else's action, right? So let's say, extreme example, you witness a murder, right? And the main character witnesses a murder, right? The murder is the action, but that's really not the action. That's not the obstacle. The obstacle is not the challenge of the murder. The obstacle is, how does that person react to the murder?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? So they still have an action. Your character, and that's a good point in general, your characters must be the driving force in your stories. A story where the character is not active, where they're just passive and things happen to them, is so boring. We hate those characters. When you have a character where things happen at them and they just sit there and react to them, it's like an anti-hero. And it's a character that we typically despise. And again, unconsciously, it's not like you think, oh, that person's evil or whatever. I'm not talking about a bad guy doing bad things. I'm talking about a character that doesn't do anything, that they don't engage the world. There are people in the world who don't engage the world, and they're typically people who are unproductive and people who are not good friends and not good partners and not good workmates. They're people that are going to be an energy suck when you're around them. We don't like those people in general in real life. We don't like them as characters either. And so if you build a character and you don't give your character activities, actions, obstacles that they can challenge, no one's going to like your character, and then they're going to change the channel. They're not going to watch your movie.
I have a question. What about, because I've seen a movie where the main character throughout the movie never changed, but a sub-character did. Is that's also possible? Does the main character always have to have a change at the end of the movie, or can another character in the movie?
So there are certainly, I mean, every rule can be broken, right? And there are movies where a character cannot change, it doesn't change. I'm sure, like you're saying, somebody changed, something was affected. Typically, if you've got a situation where, like, you've got your so-called main character that doesn't change during the course of the movie, but the fact that they don't change affects other people, then you've got an interesting story. You know, that's still an interesting story. It's sort of you're inverting the story on its head, where that, you know, the main person is not actually changing. They're still facing obstacles. But I'm sure they're still facing. What movie are you talking about?
I'm talking about The Deer Hunter. For example, Robert De Niro was the main character. His mentality basically never changed. It was Christopher Walken that changed from being, you know, a steelworker to being a Russian roulette. Brainwashed.
I think Robert De Niro changes pretty drastically.
Yeah, it's been too long since I've seen it to remember, but I would bet that there's some change that goes on in that main character too. It may not be outward change, but I don't know. But either way, regardless of that example, yes, you certainly could tell a story where the character doesn't change. First of all, I will warn you, it's going to be a lot harder to make that work. You are going against your audience's expectation. You're creating something that is going to be that much more difficult for your audience to buy. Because, again, to keep their attention. If somebody's not changing, we get bored and we disengage. So it's harder to keep their attention in that circumstance. It can be done, absolutely, but it's a challenge to do it. And even then, something needs to happen to keep us engaged. Something needs to happen. The obstacles need to keep getting worse and worse and worse. You know, an interesting example, similar, since Deer Hunter isn't fresh in my brain. Something that is The Hurt Locker, which is a new Iraq War movie that came out just this week or last week. You saw it? Anybody else see it?
Yeah, it was good.
A bunch of you have seen it. Pretty amazing movie. Really, really well done. Subtle, sophisticated, complicated story. And in that film, for the first 3/4 of the movie, or the first 2/3 of the movie, the main character doesn't really change. He faces a series of obstacles, and he overcomes them, and it makes everybody around him change. It makes everybody around him react, but he doesn't actually change. Although, at the point 2/3 of the movie, he changes dramatically, and it affects the rest of the story.
Just about Hurt Locker, who do you think is the main character? Sergeant James or?
I think Sergeant James is the main character, yeah.
Wasn't sure.
Yeah, the Anthony Mackie guy is, you know, obviously a primary character as well, but he doesn't have the main arc, right? James has the main arc. James is the one that is like this, untouchable, unpenetrable, you know, for 3/4 of the movie, and then he has that screw up, you know, where he goes and does the thing.
Yeah.
And then.
Beckham.
Yeah, and then, you know, and then that basically totally screws with him so much that then the other bad thing happens. And then, you know, in the end, I'm not going to tell you the details of the story, but in the end, you know, he sort of realizes that he can't even live a normal life. Like he's completely, he has to change who he is in a sense. Here's the thing, a lot of you guys are worried about telling cliche stories, and you should be. The reason why cliches are not interesting is because they're so predictable that no one cares. We're not interested in the story. If you tell a story that's a cliche, what it means is you're telling a story, instead of telling your own original story, you're borrowing from our expectations. We already know how that works out, and you're just giving us what we expect. And that's boring. But there's nothing wrong with starting with the familiar things. Something's only a cliche when it's predictable. But familiar patterns exist in all of our lives. We all have similar things that go on in our lives. We all face the same conflicts of, you know, of goals that are hard to achieve, and loneliness, and, you know, wanting partners, and wanting, you know, success, and dealing with failures, and dealing with, you know, disappointments, and all the different things that everybody deals with. These are the same in all of our lives. You want to use those, you want to play with those tools, but you must put them in a unique, interesting way. You must come up with the details that make your character different than the cliche. So don't be afraid to start with a cliche, just don't stop there. Start with a cliche and then develop it and make it unique and twist it so that it becomes interesting. And just a little bit about the idea of the twist. Okay, and this is something that's a little bit harder to implement, but is the mark of a good story is that there is an unexpected turning point or resolution. So that through what goes on, there is some sense of what we understand where things are going. We understand what the obstacle is. We understand, what the person's misbehaviors are and how they're going to go to change or to address those misbehaviors. But to make a story compelling, you want the way that they address those misbehaviors is not the most obvious, right? So you don't want somebody that they're the simple answer of somebody who is, I don't know, it's hard to come up with examples off the top of my head, but somebody who's got a problem with, I don't know, give me something. Somebody give me
Smoking.
Smoking. Is smoking a problem? What's the problem with smoking? Seriously. What?
Dying.
Dying?
That's a problem.
Well, is that a
It's
misbehavior?
bad for you.
It's bad for you. Is it piss off the people around them? It's hurting their health. It pisses off the people around them. It's what else? Anything else?
Depleting the ozone layer.
It's depleting the ozone layer. All right. So we got this person who smokes, and they are, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, right? But, they've got to overcome obstacles to overcome their smoking. I just identified 3 things that are wrong, the 3 elements to that misbehavior. It's pissing off the people around them, it's bad for their health, and it's depleting the ozone layer. Those become the 3 points for our obstacles, right? Those become something that addresses the challenge about that it affects the people around me. Fine, okay, I will no longer smoke in public. I'm only going to lock myself in this little chamber where I won't affect any, or I'm only going to, whatever, do this thing, so I'm only going to affect myself. And then, oh my God, well, let's let me put the ozone layer second, right? So then something occurs that I realize, it's also affecting the outer world, so I'm going to, I'm only going to smoke in my basement, and I'm going to, put these special paneling up so it doesn't work, so they overcome that obstacle. And then they realize, oh, but now it's actually killing myself. Either I'm going to need to quit smoking, or I'm going to die, right? So you've got these escalating obstacles that bring you to this point where they need to make a decision. And what is the obvious decision? Well, they're going to quit smoking and be happily, whatever. A twist would be that instead they invent a little mechanism that can make them healthy and smoke at the same time, so that they are able to resolve the real issue, which was not smoking is bad. And that's why I stopped you when you said smoking. Smoking isn't inherently bad. It's the results of smoking that are bad, right? So, the twist would be to solve the actual problem differently than the obvious expectation. And it wasn't a great example, but you want to come up with unique examples with whatever you're doing, where the way the resolution happens is not the most obvious, and it's hard. It's hard to come up with a successful twist where something happens a little bit more unexpectedly. But the more you can do it, the better you'll be able to come up with a story that is compelling.